Recent years seem to have been pretty stable for the car industry, in terms of a pretty minimal loss of manufacturers. Previous decades saw them dropping like flies, as many couldn't keep up with the pressures of foreign companies entering the markets at a lower price, and mismanagement was far more common. However, there are some manufacturers that have fallen out of the public eye without actually ceasing to exist. These companies have either been reinvented under new ownership or simply receded back to their home nation or continent, with little presence in major markets like the UK, US and Europe. These are just a few of the former giants now hiding in the shadow of their past, which you may just have forgotten about entirely, or at least assume they no longer existed. If you enjoy, please consider liking and subscribing. Hispano-Suiza is a company with quite a storied past. It can be traced back to 1898, when a Spanish army captain named Emilio de la Cuadra began making electric cars in Barcelona. He met a Swiss engineer named Marc Burkigt. They began making combustion vehicles, but the company went bust in 1903. It was then founded under the Hispano-Suiza name, rather than that being the name of the factory, and new engines were made. Production moved to France around the time of World War I, in which they also made aeroplane engines. The French arm became a separate entity, mainly owned by the Spanish business. During the Spanish Civil War and World War II, both sides of the business produced vehicles, aircraft engines and weapons, and tools. The French side was taken over by the government, and car production ended in 1938. Meanwhile, in Spain, Hispano-Suiza and some other large Spanish companies founded SIAT, which would go on to become SEAT. Hispano-Suiza itself was sold to Inasa, a state-owned company. It was bought as it was the only Spanish truck manufacturer, and because it had large facilities. The Pegaso brand was born, making trucks and later buses, and bizarrely the odd sports car, all of which was made possible using Hispano-Suiza's old factories. This was essentially the death of the brand, at least in the automotive space, as the aeroplane engine manufacturer would continue for a while, although its name was phased out eventually. There was an unsuccessful attempt to bring the manufacturer back. Erwin Leo Himmel, designer of cars such as the Audi 80, Golf Mark IV and VW Phaeton, registered the name in countries where their trademark had not been renewed. He would go on to create a division exploring alternative technologies like hydrogen. However, the company went bankrupt in 2022 with debts of 4.7 million euros, despite only having assets of less than 45,000 euros. Hispano-Suiza has actually returned though, and it's under the ownership of the Sucre Mathieu family, descendants of co-founder Damien Mathieu. The Carman was the car leading the return, an opulent all-electric supercar with a design paying tribute to Hispano-Suizas of the past. The most recent model, the Carman Sagrera, has 1,114 horsepower, a 0 to 62 time of 2.6 seconds, while also having 300 miles of range. It's very impressive stuff, and leaves me wondering what's next for the historic Spanish marque. KGM Motors is a Korean company, formerly known as SsangYong, you might have forgotten still existed. They sell only SUVs, of which they have 5, and a singular pickup truck. In the UK, it's rare to see them on the road, and I've only ever seen one small dealership, which was located in a small countryside town, shared with Isuzu, and had more used cars than KGM vehicles. Turning 70 this year, the brand also has an interesting history. It started out as Ha Dong Hwan Motor Workshop in 1954, producing trucks and buses. It merged with Dongbang Motor Co. in 1963 to form Hadong Hwan Motor Company, and the following year the new business would begin building Jeeps for the US Army, while continuing with other commercial vehicles. In 1977, it was renamed Dong-A Motor. In 1984, Kiowa, who made Jeeps under license from the American company, was taken over, spawning the long-running Corando, which is still in production today. Dong-A Motor was taken over by the SsangYong Group in 1986, and subsequently its name was changed to SsangYong Motor. The partnership with Daimler-Benz was struck in 1991, allowing SsangYong to use Mercedes-Benz technology. This led to SsangYong producing the Musso, which facilitated the company's move into the UK market. SsangYong was then taken over by Daewoo, another Korean firm. This was short-lived due to financial troubles, so 51% of SsangYong was then sold to SAIC, who now own MG. SsangYong was then in deep financial trouble, leading to plans to cut jobs, though this was met with some pretty violent and long-lasting strikes. Daewoo then struck a deal in 2010 to sell SsangYongs due to their own ongoing problems, providing SsangYong with some desperately needed cash. SsangYong was sold to Indian giants Mahindra in 2011 at a cost of $463.6 million. This initially went well, with SsangYong making a profit and selling well. However, in late 2020, SsangYong went bankrupt after Mahindra pulled the plug, due to the Korean company being in $285 million of debt. Edison Motors, maker of trucks and buses, tried to buy SsangYong, but the deal fell through. KG Group ended up paying nearly $700 million for a 61% stake, but would rename it to KG Mobility, or KGM Motors as it is known in some markets. They've since signed a few deals with companies across the world, but there hasn't been much change to their vehicles. I don't foresee much growth for KGM, as despite their cars being competitively priced, the brand is still pretty unknown in the UK and Europe, and they can't break into the luxury market, and they're not cheap enough for the budget sector. There's also only one pickup for commercial buyers, so realistically the brand will likely stay in the shadows like it has done for years, so there's no real focus in my opinion. Lancia is an Italian manufacturer, famed for making some of the most iconic rally cars of all time. Now though, it sells just one model, the Ypsilon, and doesn't sell cars outside Italy. The story starts in Turin in late 1906, where two racing drivers, Vincenzo Lancia and Claudio Fogolin, founded Lancia and C Fabbrica Automobili. Production of a Tipo 51, or Alfa as it is known, began the next year. In 1915, the first truck, named the Jota, went into production. There were plenty of innovations due to Lancia, such as a monocoque chassis, a 5-speed gearbox, and the V6, which were all developed by the Italian company. However, the brand wasn't profitable, losing £20 million in 1969, which was the same year Fiat bought the company. Under the Italian giant, Lancia would make some of the most iconic rally cars ever, in the form of the Stratos, Delta Integrale, and O37, catapulting the brand into the limelight. A partnership with Saab meant most road-going Lancias shared components with other brands, but this didn't seem to harm sales, which were over 300,000 in 1990. They did decline in the following years, however. Lancia would begin to sell versions of Chrysler models like the 300 and the Voyager in an attempt to boost sales. It was unsuccessful though, and in 2015 all of the Chrysler developed models were discontinued in Europe, and European production stopped entirely in 2017, with only the Ypsilon, their Super Mini, being sold in Italy. The Ypsilon has sold well domestically, but Lancia is a far cry of its former self. Stellantis is looking to change this, implementing a new, modern design language, and there is a possibility of something resembling the Stratos going on sale in the future. The HF Performance division has been revived with a performance version of the Ypsilon, and there is also a rally model signalling a possible return to its glory days. The Delta may also return, while a crossover is likely to be released in 2026. Lancia has recently returned to a few European countries, opening showrooms in France and Spain, as well as Benelux. It may not be in the way petrol heads are hoping, but it looks like Lancia may return to at least a fraction of its former notoriety. TVR is a British sports car manufacturer, which was once the third largest in this sector of the automotive world. Now though, the company is still very much in limbo, with little promise of a return. The story starts with Trevor Wilkinson buying a workshop in Blackpool in 1946, which became an engineering business called Trevcar Motors, renamed TVR Engineering the following year. The TVR1 was built in 1949, and its two successors, the 2 and 3, followed. The Sport Saloon, Jomar and Grand Tourer were some of the sports cars that followed, but production was slow and sales were falling. Debts were nearly £10,000 in late 1958, and the company was dissolved and reformed as Leighton Sports Cars, with Grand Tourer Engineering formed as a sister business for tax purposes. TVR then also lost its American distributor in 1959. However, Keith Aitchison and Brian Hopton bought Leighton Sports Cars and renamed it to TVR Cars. In the short term, sales rose. However, financial trouble was just around the corner due to more distributor problems, and all workers were laid off, and the company was put into receivership. Grand Chora Engineering was still up and running and completed some of the remaining orders, while a company was formed to deal with the fiberglass. Suddenly, it was all looking up, as there was new investment and new distribution deals. The Griffith was put into production. The demand for it was much greater than for prior models. However, due to international problems, the Ford engine deal was ended and TVR was forced to stop production, leading to it falling into liquidation. Fortunately, Arthur and Martin Lilly purchased the assets and formed TVR Engineering. The business essentially started with a clean slate as far as orders and debts go. The new deal for US distribution was signed, while the Tuscan and Vixen were introduced. It was going well as TVR moved to a larger factory on Bristol Avenue, Blackpool. Publicity from nude models at the TVR stand in 1970 and 1971 and motor shows drove sales. It all seemed rosy as there was enthusiasm across the pond in America and dealerships were opening up across Europe. Yet again, it didn't continue going that way for long. Despite the new Tasman being praised, it failed to sell well due to recession in the early 1980s in the UK, and TVR was once again in a precarious position. Peter Wheeler, a successful businessman and TVR enthusiast, took over in December 1981. He introduced the use of the Rover V8 and the S-Series followed in 1986. This was a success and a flurry of new models followed, like the Chimera, Griffith, Cerbera, Tuscan and Sagaris. Russian businessman Nikolai Smolensky bought TVR, although within 2 years major layoffs occurred, and Smolensky announced in October 2006 that only engine production would remain in the UK, with everything else being moved to Turin. The business was a mess though, with it transpiring that there were many different businesses, each owning different bits of the company, and on the 24th of December 2006, the company went into administration, though Smolensky bought back the business the following year. A restart was targeted, but it never came to fruition. A minority shareholder, Gullwing, which was a specialist German company, announced plans to restart production, but again, it never happened. In June 2013, the company was sold to TVR Automotive Limited, a company owned by Les Edgar and John Chasey. Plans for a new Griffith were announced, but since then, little has actually occurred. The car has been shown off, and it was announced that production would happen in Wales, with all manner of grants and loans being given to the new company. There were also plans to build a couple of electric models, although it appears this has fallen silent too. TVR has since left the facility in Wales and moved to Thruxton. There are still no tangible signs of progress though, and unfortunately, it seems as if the company will simply go bust sooner or later, without actually putting the Griffith into production. The final brand is Daihatsu, which is one of Japan's oldest car manufacturers, being traced back to 1907 with the foundation of Hatsudoki Saizu, a company that initially made steam engines and other train equipment. The automotive industry was growing quickly in Japan in the 1920s and 1930s, with foreign firms building factories in the Asian country. So Hatsudoki decided to move into this market. It began with a three-wheeler truck. Daihatsu was officially formed in 1951 as a part of a restructuring. In the 1960s, Daihatsu began exporting its cars to Europe in small quantities. Toyota bought 16.8% of a Japanese manufacturer in 1967 and has since increased its stake twice to 51.2%. The company entered the US market in 1987 with the Hi-Jet, with a Rocky and the Charade following. It was unsuccessful though, and the company shut down US sales and production of US models in 1992. The financial crisis of 2007 and the resulting global recession meant European sales hit rock bottom, and Daihatsu was never able to recover. The Japanese company announced it would pull out of the market in 2011 by 2013, citing the strong yen, which made its cars uncompetitive when it came to pricing. Since then, Daihatsu has essentially become a testing company. Over the last decade and a bit, it has been developing and testing new technologies for Toyota and its other subsidiaries. From 2023, Daihatsu's presence has been limited to Japan and Indonesia. It looks unlikely that the historic Japanese brand will become anything other than a largely forgotten manufacturer that essentially acts as a producer and tester for other Japanese brands with a global presence. Unfortunately, it seems that most of the brands discussed were unlikely to make a return to major markets, and even less likely to return to the glory that they experienced in their heydays.